Welcome to Island Connections. Today we're going to be riding in the car with Emeritus Professor John Okamura, talking about the last 5 decades of incredible work he's accomplished.
Why are we going to Kalihi?
Well, it's because about 45 years ago, actually November 1979, I began my fieldwork in Kalihi for my dissertation research in anthropology. So I moved in with immigrant family on Gulick Avenue. And I ended up staying there for about 2 years, although I'd say about a year and a half was more focused on the research, and then the last 6 months I started writing up, and then I did some follow-up interviews. So since I retired almost 5 years ago, I find myself kind of thinking back at different points, and so this being 2025, I think about, well, what was I doing in 1975, 85, 95, etc. So
what were you doing in 1975? Who was it? Was it as?
I had returned to Hawaii in August of 74 from London. I had just gotten my, actually it was a master's degree proposal approved. And I really wanted to come back to Hawaii. And so I left, I think on my birthday, July 22nd, charter flight, landed in LA about midnight, spent the night there, and then flew up to San Jose to see my parents. But I started working at Sears because I needed a job. And then I subsequently got fired, I think about 5 months ago, maybe February. And I had this part-time research job with this outfit called the Institute of Behavioral Sciences, which, like Sears, doesn't exist anymore. But the building is still there, 250 Ward Avenue,
Which is
a big condo is coming up.
Is that what we're passing by right now?
Well, you can see it from here in the corner with Ward. And so, yeah, 75, I was working at part-time at the Institute of Behavioral Sciences and taking Ilocano language classes at UH for a year, that calendar year. But I had this illusion I could come back to Hawaii and do the research without a grant. And so it took me a long time. It took me more than 5 years after I returned to Hawaii to start the field work by living in Kalihi. But I was doing other things too. I got research assistantship at the East-West Center, and then East-West Center funded my dissertation research with a grant they called a Joint Doctoral Research Internship, meaning that it was for PhD students who were doing their research at another institution than UH Mānoa. And also what happened was I got upgraded to PhD status on the basis of my research proposal. Because the department, this is one of the good things about the department at that time, they really encouraged graduate students to do field work, not to hang around London and read books. So, yeah, that's the building. That's where I was working. It used to be owned by the brother of Hiram Fong. So anyway, that's how I came to start my dissertation and research. I don't have a master's degree, and proceeded with my fieldwork after 5 years of not really making much progress, except for reading about Filipinos in Hawaii and making contacts with individuals, but not necessarily people in Kalihi. So I don't know what you think about fieldwork, Rod or Ruben, since you guys are anthropologists. And Ethan probably had similar kind of experience when you were working in Okinawa, but it comes down to developing a new set of friends, close friends that you can contact regularly and who will share their thoughts, ideas, personal feelings about issues about themselves with you, right? Don't you think so?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't the kind of research where you could go in and distribute a survey form, have a class fill it out, do that a bunch of times, and then do a statistical analysis, or even just do interviews with people you only talk to one time. I mean, fieldwork is really labor intensive. And it comes down to getting people to trust you and getting them to be willing to talk to you. And so that's why it took me so long to get going.
What kind of work did you have to do to make that happen in Kalihi?
Making myself visible. Because Kalihi at that time was maybe 1/3 Filipino. There are still older Japanese, older Portuguese, some Hawaiians. And so it's not like everyone was a Filipino immigrant and you could just walk down the street and see people, speak to people. So it involved establishing ties with people in different ways, and eventually meeting someone who became my key informant. I don't know if you guys use that term, but you know what I'm talking about.
As we used to.
Yeah, but somebody I'm sure you can identify from your own research.
One of the things that I wanted to ask is, and maybe this could be something that we can talk more about when we get to Kalihi. You talked about the demographics in Kalihi and what it would look like in the 70s, and maybe just kind of as you're doing your looking at what it looked like in the 75 to 80 to whatever, maybe you could talk about the changes in the community since when you were doing your field work there in 1980 and what it looks like now in 2025.
Sure.
So yeah.
Okay.
But, all right, I'll be back.
Okay.
Sorry, we're still taping?
Yes, we're still taping.
Still going.
We keep recording.
We're rolling.
Okay, well, how come you guys didn't ask me why I'm wearing a tie?
No, I think Ethan actually mentioned it when we were
As you were
picking you
rolling
up.
So
would you like me to ask that question real quick?
Well, you could, yeah.
I mean, I'm curious about multiple things, including the tie. But I was actually curious about how do you go from Maui to here? Like, what inspired you to even get into academia?
Well, let me talk about the tie first. No, I mean, I thought you guys would be asking me that. If you've seen me on Brahim's show, Island Connections, or I guess it's your show now, over the years, you would notice I often wore a tie because I was just kind of pretending to be a talking head, like on CNN, right? Although I should have also worn a coat, but that would be too much. And so this is a Jerry Garcia tie.
Oh, yeah.
I guess, well, did you really recognize it, Ruben?
No, I can barely see from back here, but
you're familiar with Jerry Garcia
I am
ties.
familiar with Jerry Garcia. And
Yeah. I think it's about 30 years old. I got I guess about the time he died.
Okay.
He died on my father's birthday, August 9th. Yeah, I got a couple of them. I don't think they used to sell them at what used to be called Liberty House, and then they dropped them, and they became more difficult to find in Honolulu. But of course, he doesn't make them anymore.
Right.
But he didn't really paint them. He took these designs, and then they're just multiplied, using a computer.
Right.
Yeah, but they're very colorful, like the Grateful Dead. So
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it really does, like, it makes Ethan's question a little more, like, relevant. You were a world traveler, from Maui, and then you came back here. Like, so that decision must have been a powerful one for you at that age, right? At that time, you you needed to come back here. How'd you make that decision?
Oh, it was easy because we left. 64. It was after my freshman year in high school. It was not a happy time for me. I really hated leaving Hawaii, leaving my friends. And I went to Cupertino High School because we moved to Cupertino, where my father's half-sister was living. And I went there for 3 years. It was, I'd say, 90% white. The largest group were Mexican Americans, maybe 10 to 20 in a class. But I was the only Japanese American male in my baby boomer class of about 700. There were 3 Kotong women, two of whom were cousins, but no other males. And growing up in Hawaii, lots of my friends, of course, were Japanese American males, but overwhelmingly white. The school, which is totally different now.
Cupertino's changed a bit too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The school itself is majority Asian American, a lot of Asian Indians, because of the high-tech industry. So eventually, my parents bought a house in Santa Clara, just across Stevens Creek Boulevard, main kind of drag through San Jose, through Cupertino and up to Monte Vista. And the house was about a quarter of a mile away from what became now the Google circular building, or is it a donut, whatever. At that time, it was an apple orchard. And so I used to go jogging through the apple orchard in the evenings, in the summers. And you could still see jackrabbits. It's not a rural area, but there was enough of these open spaces that wild animals could still live there. And then Hewlett-Packard bought the whole block. I was there for, I think, about 20 years until Google put up their new building there, which I haven't seen yet because since my parents died, I haven't been back to that area of California. But yeah, in terms of how did I get from Maui? Well, after graduating from college, I went to USC because I got a California State Scholarship, which allowed me to move away from home, which I very much wanted to do. I could have gone to Berkeley, but Berkeley was too close. It's an hour's drive away from Cupertino. So
no BART at the time, right? No BART at the time either, right?
No, nothing like that. And while I was in college, I started off as a math major because I had excellent math teachers at Cupertino High School. In general, it was excellent education for a public school, but that part of California, that's pretty much standard. So I started taking a lot of math courses from my freshman year. And so by the time I got to my senior year, last year, I only needed one more math course to graduate with my degree. But in my junior year, I started taking anthropology courses, and I found them a lot more interesting. And my first course was with Barbara Meyerhoff, who Rod is familiar with, because she became a well-known anthropologist for her work with Jewish elderly. The reason for that was because she'd been doing these studies of Huichol Indians in Mexico previously, but then her shaman got shot to death. So I remember her saying, well, that's the end of my research, because without the shaman, she didn't have this kind of inside knowledge anymore. That was in summer of '71. I recall her telling us that. But it was a small department in anthropology, joint department of sociology. But in my senior year, I took a course with Sally Moore, who became very well known, very, if not famous, for her work in legal anthropology. And she subsequently moved to UCLA and then Harvard, where she held the position of dean for a while. And she lived till, well, into her 90s, maybe early 90s, and she was still giving lectures. This one I found on YouTube, she was talking about her career as an anthropologist. And it was through her intervention that I was able to go to University of London to do my degree. Because she was very encouraging. The first time I ever talked to her in the fall of 1970, she said, "Are you thinking of going to graduate school?" And I said, "No, because I wanted to return to Hawaii. That had been my goal. Once I finished the degree, I knew I could move back. Although I had the draft hanging over my head, June of '71, after I finished my bachelor's degree, I got the standard letter. Greetings, you have been reclassified 1A, as opposed to having what was called a 2S student deferment. You need to report to the Oakland Induction Center for a physical examination on such and such a date." But that was an experience too, going for that. And if anything, that experience, this is '71, yeah, and pretty late in the U.S. experience in Vietnam, after the Tet Offensive, especially '68, I knew the U.S. would never win the war in Vietnam because everybody was trying to get out. Like we all went up on a bus from San Jose up to Oakland, and then I was talking to this guy as we're walking to the main building after getting off the bus. This is a young white guy. And he says, "Oh, are you going to enlist?" I said, "Man, no way." You think I want to get my ass killed in Vietnam? And then he says, "Well, you can go all over the world. You can go to Hawaii. You can go to Germany." And I said, "Well, I grew up in Hawaii. I don't need to go back that badly as a member of the military." And then he confesses. He says to me, "Well, my probation officer said either I go into the military or I go to jail." So that told me, well, these are the kinds of guys who are going into the U.S. military at that time and being sent to Vietnam. And then at the induction center, everybody's trying to get out. Everybody's got a manila envelope with something wrong with them that they want to explain to the doctor. A medical doctor is the last person you see. Prior to that time, the physical exam is like 50 guys at one time. Okay, everybody stand on your right leg. Everybody stand on your left leg. Everybody hold your hands up. And then, a guy goes down the row and checks everybody. And then only at the last point you get to talk to a doctor if you want to. And just about everybody did that because they're all trying to get out of being inducted. And the reason I got out was my number, because Nixon had initiated a lottery system based on your birthday. So your birthday indicated what number you were to be inducted, and my number, I still remember, is 154.
Wow.
So, and at that time, the U.S. was drafting guys whose numbers were going up to the low 100s. And so I thought, I'm clear. And so actually I spent the next year, because I didn't have to worry about the draft anymore, back at USC, because Sally Moore got me these part-time jobs that enabled me to live. And then she got me a job as an undergraduate TA, because there was no graduate program in anthropology, much like ethnic studies. So I was a TA for Barbara Meyerhoff's big intro class in anthropology. So when I came to ethnic studies, I was very familiar with this idea of undergraduates serving as, well, what we called lab leaders. Huh? So we had kind of similar roles in terms of how we work with smaller groups, discussion groups of undergraduate students taking a course. And so Sally Moore, the person I met taking an anthropology course my last year at USC, was the one who really encouraged me to go to graduate school, and also to London in particular. She said I could probably get into schools like the University of Chicago, which was the top American department in anthropology. And she also said, well, she didn't tell me this. This other guy in the department told me, he asked me once if I was thinking about going to graduate school. And I said, well, Dr. Moore has mentioned the possibility of my going to the University of London. Well, technically, I'm talking about the University College London, because the University of London is divided into, I think, about 40 different schools and colleges. And he told me, well, if Sally writes you a letter to the chair of the Department of Anthropology at University College, you'll get in. There'll be no question. You don't have to bother taking the GRE exam, anything like that. And that's what happened. Because the chair there was a guy named M.J. Smith, who was from Jamaica, and he had written about pluralism in Africa and also the British Caribbean. And I was interested in issues of race and ethnicity at that time, but not as specifically as my interest would develop. It was just a kind of general interest about issues concerning ethnic relations and ethnicity. So I went there to study with him, and then he was the one who got me upgraded to PhD status, although by the time I finished, he had already left for Yale. But his influence on my early work, some of the writings about Filipino immigrants in Kalihi, one can easily see from what he had written before. For example, he wrote a book about stratification in Grenada, Grenada being one of these small former British colonies. And so my interest in ethnicity and inequality was based on his work on stratification. And then also my interest in kinship and community I took from one of his articles. And also the idea of, I developed later about local identity. It was based on an article he wrote on West Indian culture and society. Is there such a thing throughout the British Caribbean? And from that, I developed the idea of there being such a thing as local identity. And the first article is actually subtitled Local Identity and Society. There's no real local society. I wouldn't call it that.
What year was that?
It was the first one I wrote, 1983. It was a Emeritus special issue on Hawaii that Daviana and Marion Kelly also had articles in.
I think like Mimi Sharma had a piece in there too, right?
Yeah, Mimi, because she was doing work on Filipino immigrants.
Class formation, I think, right?
Yeah, she got more into this kind of class analysis subsequently. But from M.G. Smith's work on West Indian culture, I got the idea of subordination. And the groups that are considered local are those that share this historical subordination to Hawaiʻis. And that's why Hawaiʻis are not considered local by most people in Hawaii, although I would argue for local, there being such a thing as local Hawaiʻis based on my experience growing up in Hawaii, and there are people I still consider local Hawaiʻis. Today is the first day of Lent, I believe, right?
Wednesday.
Right?
Yes.
When I was teaching in the Philippines, I guess it would have been 85 would have been my first Lent. And all the students have this black mark on their face. I go, what the hell is going on? Because I wasn't familiar with Ash Wednesday, but they had gone to Mass, which was held, actually you could go if you really wanted to, at La Salle, where I was teaching. And so that familiarized myself with Ash Wednesday and the beginning of Lent. So one of the really good contacts I made was with Sister Elnora, who was based at St. Anthony's, but she wasn't a teacher. Most of the sisters were teachers, and they lived in that house next to the church. And what Sister Elnora did, because she was Ilocana, unlike I think most of the other sisters weren't, so she had very close ties with the Ilocano immigrants in Kalihi, and she organized, well, various Catholic rituals, but conducted in the Philippine style, which means in the surrounding neighborhood. Mm. So Lent, they would do these Stations of the Cross every Friday night, evening, which any Catholic throughout the world is familiar with. And it will probably start on Wednesday in churches. But besides the Catholic ritual in the church, Sister Elnora would organize Stations of the Cross in the community. And that's only possible if there are sufficient numbers of Filipino immigrants in the community. In the Philippines, there's no problem, except for Muslim parts of the country, because most people are Catholic. And so she would have different families to represent the different stations. You know, there are 15 Stations of the Cross, right?
Wait, so explain what are the Stations of the Cross for people who might not know what that is?
These are events that occurred as Jesus was being taken to his crucifixion. And so these families, say, along one street here, and then in Ahu'ula, Elueni, Kamuali, different Friday evenings would represent the different stations, and then a group of these people who came regularly for the prayers would gather here at St. Anthony's, and then they proceed along these different streets. Because most of the people along this part of Kalihi, especially majority at that time, were Filipinos, and particularly post-65 immigrants. So there was no problem finding 15 families along one street to represent the different stations. Other Catholic communities, I don't think you could as easily do it. People would have to walk much farther distances to go from one station to the next. But these are only possible if there are sufficient numbers of Filipino immigrants in the community. So by doing these rituals beyond the confines of the church, this was a representation of Kalihi as a Filipino, but particularly post-65 Filipino immigrant community, because there are lots of local Filipino families too. But for the most part, I didn't see them participating in the rituals.
Yeah. But can you explain that difference? Because You're talking about post-65 immigrants versus the local
Yeah.
community, and what is
well, because Filipinos have been moving into Kalihi since before World War II, you know, as a working class community. And it was very multi-ethnic at that time. Even when I was doing my research, there were these older Portuguese families who also attended the church, and older Japanese and Hawaiian families. But with post-65 immigration, it allowed for the families, Filipino families, to what the people talk about, send for their relatives, you know, by petitioning them according to the 65 immigration law, which gave priority for the recruitment of relatives to come to the U.S., close relatives, brothers, sisters, children, parents.
The family reunification.
Yeah, through those kinds of provisions in the 65 immigration law. And this is how Kalihi developed over time after the law was passed, through these extended family ties. And people moved to Kalihi. I think there was a kind of public perception that Filipinos lived in Kalihi because it was a poor community, but that's not necessarily the case. Filipino immigrants moved to other Filipino communities because that's where their relatives lived. So if you had relatives in Waipahu, you would initially settle there. If you had relatives on Maui, you would initially settle there. Or if they were living in Daly City, this is where you would go. And so those who settled in Kalihi, it's because they had relatives here. And this was the case with the family I was living with. They petitioned the brothers of the father and the family I was staying with to Hawaii, and they settled, well, at least initially, in Kalihi because of his presence. And the local Filipino population was certainly here as a result of that earlier migration of Filipino former plantation workers to Kalihi. And the church is actually one of the settings where you would find these interactions between local and immigrant Filipinos in the Filipino Catholic Church. One of the few organizations I became familiar with that had both significant numbers of local Filipinos born and raised here, living in Kalihi, and post-65 immigrants. The hometown associations were overwhelmingly post-65 immigrants, or immigrants in general. They had still had 1980 old-timers who had come in the 20s, and those who had come in the 46. But very few local Filipinos. Even the children wouldn't participate in the hometown associations. You know, they were primarily immigrant institutions, mutual aid associations. The group that I work most closely with, because of my one of my key informants was from San Nicolas. You know, this is one town away from Lawag. You cross the bridge and you're in Lawag. Mm-hmm. And large numbers of San Nicolas immigrants came to Hawaii. On this island, Waialua had another significant population. On Maui, there's a population of people from San Nicolas also. And my informant friend was a travel agent. And travel agents tend to be well known in the community because, of course, they facilitate travel to the Philippines. And so he had an office, technically it would be Palama, along King Street, above Jean's Market, which was a very popular market at that time. It carried the Philippine newspapers. You could buy a Philippine newspaper same day it was published in the Philippines because of the time difference. But they would come in on the airplanes, and then they'd have them available there. And also the Philippine weeklies like Banawag, you know, in Ilocano. And so that was one of the places I was hanging out with at my friend's travel agency, the second floor of that building. And he was a well-known, popular guy. Lots of people liked him. So they dropped by his office in the afternoons after work. And that's how I got to meet other people there. And became familiar with immigrants from San Nicolas through my friendship with him. So Ahu'ula Street there's a concentration of San Nicolas families who had bought houses there. And so I asked my friend, well, how did that happen? Was that kind of planned on their part because they wanted to live close to each other? And he said, no, it just came about because the opportunity arose for a family to buy a house on Ahu'ula Street. And that's where, for me, it kind of established his validity, somebody I could really trust in terms of the information he was giving to me. Because a superficial answer to me would have been, oh yeah, because they wanted to live close to each other, because they all knew each other coming from San Nicolas. But he gave me a much more nuanced answer, much more, to me, truthful answer. Not necessarily because they're all from San Nicolas, but because the houses were available for sale, and that's why they bought them. So here, there's a high concentration, let's say, of Filipino immigrants than below Dillingham, which we're facing now. Families below Dillingham, I thought of as much more kind of impoverished in a way, more rental housing, and people here tended to purchase homes, although there are lots of people renting the homes too, and that's how the bigger houses were being paid for, because there would be these rental arrangements for renting a room, which is what I did also with the family I was living with, for $100 a month, and a young couple with a child could do that and share the kitchen facilities, bathroom facilities, until they had a stable enough income and they could move out. So in terms of the question you asked me about demographic changes, well, now I'm sure Kalihi is majority Filipino, because the older Japanese, Portuguese, Hawaiian families have perhaps died since then.
Or moved away. Or moved away, right?
Yeah, but also some Filipino families were moving away too. They would purchase homes in the leeward area, Pearl City, Waipahu, as their incomes became more stabilized. But then other people would move in too. And one of the things I would say was going on, which to some extent still continues, is what I call urban redevelopment by Filipino immigrants, because they would purchase houses and then they would tear down the old house. Well, initially what they might do is put up a 2-story house. They would raise the house on a concrete block frame. And so the lower portion of the house would be rented out. And this would be a way to pay for that investment in putting up a 2-story house. Or other families also did that, put up 2-story homes like this. And then again, the owners would live in the upper floor, and the renters would live in the the lower floor. And this would be another way of paying for the house, the improvements, by renting out to a family. So rather than put a garage in, there's no income if you just have a garage. They would build another unit on the first floor. And so you could see this in Kalihi in different parts where families had done that, and especially if they had tore down the old wooden house, which was decades old, and put up a totally new house like this. And this is what happened with the family I was living with. Because for Filipino, especially immigrants, they see housing here as an investment, because they know they can recoup their investment by renting out the rooms in the homes. And this is how families paid for these houses, or families purchase houses. They use the term kompang, which I think is pidgin English, from company. And in terms of St. Anthony's here, the school has closed, surprisingly. The private Catholic school, you would think there's no shortage of students. And it was very much a thriving school at the time I was here, but I was very surprised when it closed down several years ago.
But is that also, I mean, this can be a segue into some of your other research, but is that also kind of a consequence of the differences between public and private schools and how the educational systems are shaped in Hawaii, or how that's impacting different communities in different ways?
Well, sure. Most Filipino immigrants send their children to public school. They don't necessarily want to spend money on a private school education. Those who sent their kids to St. Anthony's when I was here were especially concerned with a Catholic education. And they knew that there were Catholic sisters teaching at the school, so that was a kind of primary reason for doing so. But I guess that importance declined over the decades, but those rituals, I'm not sure when they ended.
Yeah.
Once Sister Elnora left and returned to the Philippines, I have a feeling that they stopped. But it was one of the things I emphasized in my dissertation, and I've written, included a discussion about the Philippine Catholic rituals because of the way that it really marked Kalihi as a Filipino immigrant community, even though they weren't at that time even a majority of the population. And it was just part of the ways in which I sought as an anthropologist to distinguish Kalihi as a Filipino immigrant community culturally and socially. And the rituals were one of those ways because they were conducted in a Philippine fashion in the surrounding neighborhood, which again marked the community as being Filipino. The other thing I would...
But why do you think that's changed though? Because by the time I come here in the mid-90s, I'm not seeing those same kinds of rituals happening, right? In the same community.
Yeah.
Like, I had moved here initially. I wasn't seeing the same kind of thing.
Well, it took, I think, Sister Elnora's organizational abilities, the respect that people had for her.
But even if it's established, these are things that we do in May, these are the things that we do as part of Lent, even if that person leaves, it would seem like if it was important for the community, it would be sustained.
Well, it would be sustained at the church. One could still participate in Stations of the Cross rites every Friday evening in the church, right? Because the pictures are all on the walls of the church.
But not in the ways that it was done in the community.
Yeah. And it's primarily women too. Very few men took part in the Stations of the Cross or the May Flores de Mayo prayers, evening prayers. The alternative as a Catholic is, well, you could still do the prayers at church as opposed to doing it in the community, in a manner that they were familiar with prior to coming to Hawaii. But again, I wouldn't be surprised at all if these rituals as conducted in San Nicolas were primarily by men.
But then it changes when it's being done here.
Yeah, well, it becomes more significant as a way to mark the community as a Filipino community by going beyond the confines of the church. This is what I was trying to establish ethnographically. What makes Kalihi a Filipino immigrant community besides the marunggay trees you can see all over.
Yeah, because if you think about it, so 1980, when you're doing your field work, and then flash forward to 2025, Kalihi is still marked as a Filipino community. What makes it a Filipino community now, or what makes it a different kind of Filipino community now versus what you were seeing and what you were observing and living in the 1980s?
Okay. Well, demographically, it's much more Filipino population. No question. The majority,
raw numbers.
Of the population is Filipino. There are more businesses along King Street than before. Restaurants. There was a Elena's that subsequently opened. The first Elena's, well, maybe not the first, but there was an Elena's restaurant. And then Golden Coin, the first Golden Coin opened also on King Street. So lots more businesses than before along King Street. Some more grocery stores. Puhali Market, which unfortunately is closed. That was run by a woman from San Nicolas. It's still a working class community, no question about that. Because people move out and then they're replaced by other post-65 immigrants. And for people who live here, they see it as a desirable place where perhaps most non-Filipinos wouldn't necessarily view Kalihi as a desirable place to live, but it's the proximity to work, particularly downtown, or to Waikiki, where many people work as in the hotels as restaurant and hotel workers. So the proximity is, as opposed to living in Waipahu, is one reason for wanting to live in Kalihi. People have different understandings about communities than, say, non-Filipinos would have.
It seems like you're talking about like the class structure and how it's changing. What about like I don't know, I guess since we're the anthropologists in this car, what about the cultural stuff? And maybe this is your British training coming in, because you're talking about the structure stuff. But
I can't really say. It's been such a long time in terms of persistence of cultural traditions like kinship relations. I imagine there's still continued the use of kinship terms, which are like manong, manang, tata, nana, because those are so, they persist in being important to Filipinos back in the Philippines.
Right.
So I see no reason why they would necessarily decline, except for local Filipinos. Yeah, that's where it drops off. The children born in Hawaii, far less likely, except for the women perhaps, young girls, to follow those kinds of kinship norms of respect for elderly. And the use of the kinship terms in addressing elders. But other ways they still would persist, maintaining kinship ties through sending remittances, and that has become commercialized. You can do that much more easily than when I was doing my field work. When I was doing my field work, people would ask those who were going back to the Philippines to take money for them. And the first time I went back, I joined a group of balikbayans through my travel agent friend, and I'll mention his name because he enabled me to get my PhD. There's no question. Elo Badra is his name. And so he offered me a very discounted ticket, $300 round trip to the Philippines to join the group of balikbayans he was taking back with him as a travel agent for the town fiesta. And so people knew I was going back, and so they'd ask me to, they gave me a card, and I thought it was a Christmas card, letters. And when I went to the town, I asked Elo, like, where do these people live? And so he take me to their homes in the Municipio area. And then they'd open up the envelopes and they're stuffed with $100 bills. I had no idea that amount of money was in there. I wasn't really.
You didn't know that you were transporting all this
all that money.
American dollars.
Yeah, and I just have it in my bag with me. And that was part of the sending back of money, which became commercialized. And in the 1990s, one could do it through an ATM machine, through Wells Fargo Bank. I think was the first one in California, because they had branches in the Philippines. And as long as you had the account number, you could transfer money. So actually later on, my wife started sending money too, to Philippine National Bank. She could send money to her mother in particular, if she gave cash. But it took longer actually, at least 24 hours.
Right.
But with the Wells Fargo, virtually instantaneous. And then sending what Ilocanos call pawit, that has become commercialized to balikbayan boxes.
Right.
But before, you do it as a favor to people. And then people would ask me too. And so I think the biggest thing I took back was a television set, portable television set for somebody.
In a cardboard box?
Yeah. Because it was something, a lady I got to know and I liked very much. And her relatives were living in Manila, so it was
Must have been
relatively easy.
great packaging.
Yeah. Well,
Because
yeah.
this is not the flat screen TVs and things that we're talking about, right?
Yeah. But it was a small box compared to the other balikbayan boxes. And the Pampers box was a popular one people would get from supermarkets because it was regulation size.
Right.
And then all kinds of goods would be in there. And this was part of the research that I subsequently did, writings I subsequently did on the Filipino diaspora. And migrant being these transnational connections that constitute the diaspora, not thinking of it as primarily an immigrant community or a second, third generation community. And those were regular kinds of interactions, transnational, between immigrants living here and the families in the Philippines, sending money, sending consumer goods, spam, and send coffee, toothpaste,
Right.
soap.
Shampoos.
Yeah. Things that weren't, American made. You can buy Philippine spam, you can buy Philippine corned beef, but tastes very different from that made in the here. And those are the kinds of ways that, my argument was the Filipino diaspora is imagined through the circulation of goods, through the visits. So the return visits also another way of maintaining transnational connections. So when I went, the San Nicolas Town Fiesta was held the day after Christmas. Opening ceremony featured balikbayans. There were about 50 of them from different parts of the world, and they talk about where they were working at this time. Saudi Arabia, Hong Kong, because a lot of Ilocano women subsequently worked as domestic workers in Hong Kong, some in California, people, immigrants. And walking around San Nicolas, at least I guess they call it Poblacion, the central area around the municipio. Yeah. You could see the homes of people who had relatives living abroad because they would send the money back for them to build these sturdier homes, concrete homes. And the only other people who had those kinds of homes were the big people in the town, the doctors, engineers, professionals, lawyers, etc. Big landowners. And I'm sure that has changed, especially for San Nicolas having so many immigrants going abroad. But it's the same kind of process of newer housing being constructed.
So basically what you were seeing here in Kalihi is also happening in the hometowns in the Philippines in terms of the houses.
Oh yeah, yeah. And the term diaspora, I became familiar with while I was still in the Philippines. But my initial research, I wasn't using the term, writing my dissertation in 1982. But clearly that's what was going on through transnational connections.
I'm wondering, we've talked about how, the church has shaped the identities here for a while, proximity to Waikiki, businesses going all up along here, shaping these things, and giving, Filipino peoples a chance to crystallize ethnic identity, right? How, if you can theorize about how is the rail pushing through right here going to be reshaping, shifting these communities' relationship to each other and to their ethnic identity, right? Through stratification of all these, inequalities that are going to get pushed through here. So
I'm not so sure. Certainly there are Filipino Americans living Mackay of Dillingham. The community extended beyond that area. But to me, this is the heart of the Filipino community between King Street, and above King Street also, and then to Dillingham, between Kalihi Street and Mokuāwea. This is a very densely Filipino community. I'm not so sure how rail will divide the community as happened with freeways, right? In cities in the continental U.S., if it creates a barrier. I think in many ways it facilitates employment because people can travel faster now with rail, at least to downtown from the leeward area. And from downtown, or at least Civic Center, wherever that is, they can catch a bus to Waikiki.
You don't foresee any kind of a similar process that things like rail has done in other cities?
I haven't given that much thought, to that issue. I thought about it primarily in terms of making it easier for people to commute from the leeward area into downtown, where a lot of Filipino immigrants work, and from there continuing on to Waikiki, where many people work. As opposed to Lahaina, where lots of Filipino immigrants were living, but there's no viable public transportation to Kanapali, Napili, the resort areas. Rail has facilitated, it will facilitate that kind of employment, which is one of the reasons I believe Cayetano was defeated when he ran for mayor, because he was anti-rail. He wasn't going to get Filipinos to vote for him, taking that position, because they could see the advantages for themselves if rail is built. But dividing the community, I'm not so sure, because you can still cross over.
Well, thank you, Dr. Okamura, for everything you have brought into our lives through your long and illustrious career. Thank you for your hard work you've done for the Department of Ethnic Studies over these so many years. And I'm very excited to kind of see what comes next out of your research briefs and your ongoing work. I doubt you'll ever really retire, because we're going to keep calling you back for episodes of Island Connections. Thank you.